One of the main things they talked about, and Justin Trudeau did, particularly on the following the first weekend of the invocation of the Emergencies Act, was these horrible, the Nazi flag and all those things that people saw in Ottawa. You heard him say that?
Again, I have to say, prior to coming here, I have not specifically reviewed specific statements of the Prime Minister. If you want to point to a specific one, maybe we could discuss it.
And you'd agree if it turned out those flags were linked to your government. That would look really bad for our international reputation, wouldn't it?
Based on some...
Okay, next.
Chrystia Freeland brutalized by Brendan Miller. She doesn't recall a lot in this full question period. What she does know is that she vaccinated herself and her kids 4 times. Here's the clip.
So, ma'am, I understand the mandate regarding truckers that led to the protest that came into effect on January 15th, 2022. Is that correct?
I don't recall the exact date, but I'm prepared to believe you are citing it correctly.
And during the pandemic, from March 20 through January 15th, 2022, there was no such regulation, right?
Again, I don't recall the exact dates myself, but I do know we didn't have the mandate and then it came into force.
Right. And just so the folks at home understand, a regulation is a different type of law. It's passed by the executive branch alone, not by all of Parliament, right? Like the Emergencyact.
There is absolutely a distinction between things a government can do by regulation and things it can only do by legislation.
Right. And so would you agree with me that given that during the throes of the pandemic, from March 2020 through to January 15th, 2022, and we had no regulation, you didn't need one?
No. I believe that taken as a whole, the public health measures that Canada put in place were very, very important in protecting the health and safety of Canadians.
I only have so much time, so I'm going to cut you off there. And you'd agree with me that given that there was no regulation in place from March 2020 through January 15th, 2022, during the throes of the pandemic, there was no reason to pass one on January 15th, 2022, was there? There was no health risk.
No, I'm afraid I don't agree. In January, we had an Omicron wave. We were still fighting COVID, and there was a real value in encouraging as many Canadians as possible to get vaccinated.
So the purpose was to encourage Canadians to get vaccinated, to compel them to get vaccinated. Is that fair?
That's right.
All right. So that was the purpose of the regulation. That was the true purpose. It wasn't to keep people safe. It was to get them vaccinated.
I believed then, and I believe now, that creating strong incentives for Canadians to be vaccinated protected the health of vaccinated Canadians and protected the health of our country overall.
Okay. So from March 2020 to January 15th, 2022, did you fail to protect Canadians by not having that regulation?
Let me start with one aspect of that timeline, which is obviously when COVID first hit us, vaccines didn't exist. And then even when vaccines arrived, it took time for them to be distributed. So, of course, vaccine mandates couldn't be put in place before vaccines existed or were made available.
So, and of course, the government, you ended up creating a vaccine compensation fund in December of 2020. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Right. And you're aware that Quebec had a vaccine compensation fund and it was the only province that actually had one prior to that?
I am prepared to accept that that's the case. I can't recall specifically.
And can you agree with me that the United States has a federal vaccine compensation fund?
Again, I'm prepared to accept that that's the case.
So from 1867, when Canada was founded, up until December of 2020, Canada had no federal vaccine compensation fund. Can you agree with that?
Again, I'm not an expert in the history of vaccine compensation funds in Canada.
But you can agree the first compensation fund in Canada for vaccines came about only because of the COVID vaccines, correct?
Again, I'm really not an expert in vaccine compensation funds. If the direction of the question is to suggest that the COVID vaccines are more dangerous in some way than previous vaccines we've used in Canada, I'll say, one, I'm not a health expert, but I believe very much in really the advice, the effectiveness, the thoroughness of Health Canada.
Okay.
They're very good at judging the safety of vaccines. And I will say, I have been vaccinated 4 times. My children have been
I understand,
vaccinated.
ma'am. I don't need to know that. But
it does speak to my confidence in the vaccines. If I've had my children vaccinated, it speaks to my belief that they're safe.
Please stop talking out the clock and let me ask my questions, okay? So,
Well, it's a bit of a trade-off. You make a statement and you say, do you agree? And she qualifies the answer.
Yeah.
That's appropriate.
okay. So, ma'am, if that's the case, then did Health Canada advise you to enact this regulation?
The mandate.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not the health minister, and I'm not going to speak to specific moments that we had advice.
Okay.
But what I will say is we were very careful and thoughtful throughout COVID in the public health measures that we put in place and acted based on advice of PHAC.
Right. And so that mandate was only in place until June of 2022, right?
Again, I can't recall the specific dates, but I'm prepared to accept what you're saying.
We're going to move on into just another area. I take it you know who Tamara Leach is, right?
I don't know her personally, but I have read about her.
Yeah. And you know who Chris Barber is?
Again, I don't know him personally, but I've read about him.
Yeah. And you know who Tom Marazzo is, right?
Can you say the third name?
Tom Marazzo, the gentleman over there?
I can't say that I know as much about him or I've heard as much about him.
And what about Danny Bulford? You know who he is, correct?
What was that final last name?
Danny Bulford, he used to be with the security team for the RCMP with the Prime Minister.
I'm afraid I'm not so familiar with that final name.
So
Tamara Leach and Chris Barber I've heard of, yes.
And when you were making your decision with respect to invoking the Emergencies Act, you'd already heard about Tamara Leach and Chris Barber?
I had heard of their names, yes.
Yeah, and there's some discussions about them in some of the records. There was issues. You knew who they were.
I had read their names in the media.
Yeah, and you knew about that before you invoked the Emergencies Act.
Again, I can't say 100% not having reviewed what I read, but my recollection is they were reasonably prominent, and so I think it's reasonable to think that I would have read their names.
And of course, you know Tamara Leach, she's a Canadian.
Again, I haven't familiarized myself with her biography before coming here.
She's from Alberta. Do you know that? Where you're from?
I really haven't studied about her before coming here. I want to be careful that I say things I know for sure are true. I am certainly Canadian, and I'm born in Peace River, Alberta. Okay.
Is Tamara Leach a terrorist?
In terms of designating who is a terrorist and who isn't, that is not my job as Minister of Finance or Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay.
We have authorities whose job is to do that.
Right. And so it's not your authority to designate Tamara Leach, Chris Barber, Tom Marazzo, or Danny Bulford terrorists. That's somebody else has to do that.
Yes, we have intelligence services. We have enforcement agencies whose job is to determine who is a terrorist, and that's entirely appropriate.
Can I bring up?
Can I say one thing about that?
Yeah, just a second. If I can bring up document ssm.cam.000876/rel.001, please. And you can, while he's pulling that up, if you want to add to your answer. Okay, if we can scroll down to page I believe this is a note with Dave. What page? 12? Page 12, please. And this is a note that I understand you wrote with Dave from CSIS. That's 11. And this is a meeting with Dave from CSIS. And if you scroll down, keep going. Okay. And there you say that you need to designate the group as terrorists. So, but it's not your job, but you wanted to designate them as terrorists, right?
So that handwritten note in my notebook, I can assure you that was not a meeting with the director of CSIS, with whom I didn't have a meeting.
It says it's okay. It's with David Vignon from CSIS.
It doesn't say that. It says it's with a gentleman called Dave.
Which Dave?
That meeting, that is not an account of
Which
a
Dave?
Meeting with Dave Vigneault because I didn't have
Dave
a meeting
which Dave is in
with
those notes,
the CSIS
ma'am?
director.
Which Dave is in those notes? What's Dave's last name?
I need to see my whole notebook that you're referring to, but I can tell you for
It only
certain.
says Dave.
I can tell you for certain that I did not have a meeting during this time with the CSIS director.
Okay, so
I can exclude that 100%.
I'm just going to, this isn't a document, I don't need to bring it up, but you stayed in the House. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite has just used the bad apple excuse. She has excused the desecration of the national. Yes?
My friend is saying he's referring to something that the Deputy Prime Minister said in the House.
Yeah.
There's an objection there for parliamentary privilege.
This is a parliamentary commission. There is no parliamentary privilege.
It does exist. Parliamentary privilege
absolutely,
does exist.
It does exist, but because this is a report to Parliament pursuant to the case I gave you earlier, McIver, it doesn't apply. You can actually ask all of it because we're carrying out a parliamentary function and there's no liability here. It's just a report to Parliament, and the Federal Court of Appeal has agreed.
I'm not aware of that.
I gave you the McIver case quite a while ago when we talked about the objections, and I think, it's there.
Well, I'd ask my friend the document that he's referring to so that we know what he's talking about, so we can understand the parliamentary.
This is
privilege issue.
just a statement from the Deputy Prime Minister in the House. And Mr. Speaker, the members opposite this is what it says: use just the bad apples excuse. She has excused the declaration.
I think we're going to have to sort this out because I don't think at this stage, and I apologize, I'm not as familiar with you as you are about that case, and clearly the Crown is not either, the government. So I think we're going to have to find that. So I'd like you to hold that
Okay, I'll come
question.
back to it. But you do recall, ma'am, that you had expressed concerns publicly with respect to desecration to national monuments. Is that fair?
I'm going to need advice from my counsel on whether things I said in Parliament I should be speaking about.
Okay,
I'm
so
not
here
an
I'll
expert
move
either,
on. It's
so.
okay. So one of the things that happened during the protest in Ottawa dealt with the national monument, the Terry Fox statue. Do you remember reading about that?
I do. Yes, I do remember the Terry Fox statue. I remember discussing it with my children.
Yeah,
who were very upset.
Yeah, and there was in that Terry Fox statue, they put a hat on Terry Fox's head and then put a flag in his arm, and then there was a mandate freedom sign on it.
I don't remember specifically how the Terry Fox statue was implicated in this, but I do remember reading about it, and I remember it specifically because my children were aware of it and were upset.
Right, and so I went online and I just looked at how many times someone's done that to that statue, and it seems to be hundreds. So I'm just going to put this one to you. If someone puts an LGBTQ flag on the Terry Fox statute and flowers in the statute, is that a desecration?
I am not going to go into, I really don't think it's my job or helpful for Canadians for me to go into a discussion of what is okay and not okay.
But you said it was a
Terry Fox
desecration.
statue.
When you've called it a desecration in public, that was what you're referring to. based on what was put on the statute. So is it fair to say that it's only a desecration to you if you don't agree with the message?
Again, you've made a couple of leaps beyond anything that I've said.
That's okay. It's the public record. With respects to, you had said you had concerns for violent actions and interactions with respect to protesters, and I take it that was nationally? You had concerns nationally? Or was it just Ottawa?
I described in my testimony a moment ago 2 specific areas where I had concern. I was worried about the potential for conflict between angry people in Ottawa and the occupation.
Okay.
Can I finish the answer? Because I have something to add. And as I said in my earlier testimony, and I believe the mayor of Windsor shared this concern, I was concerned about the possibility of that kind of a conflict in Windsor. And I was concerned about the situation in Coutts,
Okay.
which we heard about at the IRG
Right.
on this Saturday.
Okay, so, but with respect to the interaction with protesters, I don't know if you heard the testimony of the mayor there, but he said that 75% of his small town supported the blockades and that many of the properties have F. Trudeau flags all over them. So you wouldn't have concern with that specific protest, would you?
My reference to Coutts just now was very specific. At the IRG on Saturday, the 12th of February, the RCMP commissioner raised with us the possibility that there were weapons there. And
Right.
that was a source of great concern.
Right, and so you can agree that police investigate weapons offenses all over the country every day.
Again, I'm not a police expert, but that seems like a reasonable common sense observation.
So simply because the police know a weapon is somewhere, you can agree with me it's not a national emergency.
The concern about a single weapon somewhere in Canada, and as you say, I think that one weapon being investigated somewhere in Canada, if that were to happen today, certainly.
Right, and you had testified earlier about what you viewed as, ensuring that we as Canadians have a good international reputation so that people come to our country and want to do business with us. Is that fair?
Yes, that's something I was very concerned about.
Okay, and I take it when you consider those sort of things, you look at various reports, and I'm sure you look at various indexes, and I'm sure you look at the Transparency International Index. Is that fair?
I am familiar with the Transparency International Index, but I haven't looked at it recently.
Okay. Well, since 2019, we've began to fall. All right? And we have now come down out of the top 10, and it continues to decline. So can you agree with me that Canada not being transparent hurts our relationship internationally?
I have to say that I disagree with the premise of the question. I think Canada is a very transparent democracy. And in fact, the commission that we're part of right now is a part of Canadian transparency.
Right.
That's why it's important.
And on that point, if I told you that there is a whole bunch of unlawfully redacted documents that we've been fighting over and we're waiting for an order just to get them today, and we haven't had them for this whole proceeding, do you think that's transparent?
Again, and with apologies, I can't agree with the premise of the question. I think that,
Right.
but what I can say is, I think that the fact that this commission exists, that these hearings are being held, that they're public, is really important for Canada and is a measure of Canadian transparency.
Right. And one of your concerns, of course, with transparency and our reputation was that you would want your government to be as transparent as possible, right?
Again, here, I do believe that transparency and accountability are important, but I also recognize that cabinet confidentiality in many issues needs to be preserved for a reason. And, you know, there are areas where transparency is not appropriate, and I recognize that as well.
Okay. Can you agree with me if, you know, anytime it comes out that the Canadian government has misled Canadians on something, it really hurts our international reputation, doesn't it?
I think that the Canadian government should always seek not to mislead Canadians.
Right.
First and foremost, because that's wrong, and that is not the way we should treat Canadians.
And in the many statements that have been said by all the politicians in this matter, one of the main things they talked about, and Justin Trudeau did, particularly on the following the first weekend of the invocation of the Emergencies Act, was these horrible, the Nazi flag and all those things that people saw in Ottawa. You heard him say that?
Again, I have to say, prior to coming here, I have not specifically reviewed specific statements of the Prime Minister. If you want to point to a specific one, maybe we could discuss it.
And you'd agree if it turned out those flags were linked to your government. That would look really bad for our international reputation, wouldn't it?
Based on some...
Okay, next.